The winter of 1863 descended upon Hollow Creek like a biblical plague, wrapping the isolated Utah settlement in an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the prayers of the faithful. Snow drifted against the weathered wooden structures of the Lafferty compound, creating an almost ethereal landscape that belied the darkness festering within the largest homestead on the hill. The settlement itself was nothing more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings scattered across a valley that seemed forgotten by both God and government, accessible only by a treacherous mountain pass that remained impassable for months during the harsh winter seasons. Obadiah Lafferty stood at the frost-covered window of his study, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the pale morning light that filtered through the thick glass he had imported at considerable expense from Salt Lake City. His deep-set eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the Wasatch Mountains, gazed out at the barren landscape with the intensity of a man who believed he could see beyond the veil of mortality into the very throne room of the Almighty. At 47, his once robust build had been whittled down by years of fasting and what he called spiritual purification, leaving him with the appearance of an Old Testament prophet, all sharp angles and burning conviction, his dark hair streaked with premature gray, and his beard grown long in the style of the ancient patriarchs. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable. When Obadiah first arrived in Utah Territory 15 years earlier, he had been a respected member of the Mormon community, a successful merchant with a thriving business and a reputation for piety and charitable works. His first wife, Martha, had been the daughter of a prominent church elder, and their marriage had been celebrated as a union blessed by heaven itself. But somewhere in the isolation of Hollow Creek, something had begun to change in Obadiah's mind, a slow corruption that he interpreted as divine revelation. "The angel spoke to me again last night," he murmured to his eldest son, Ezekiel, who stood nervously by the door, clutching a leather-bound journal whose pages had grown thick with his father's increasingly disturbing revelations. The young man's hands trembled slightly as he held the book, its weight seeming to increase with each new entry he was forced to record. "What did he say, Father?" Ezekiel's voice barely rose above a whisper, the words catching in his throat like thorns. At 23, he had inherited his father's lean build, but none of his charismatic presence. Instead, fear had carved premature lines around his eyes, and his shoulders bore the permanent stoop of someone perpetually braced for punishment. His dark hair hung limp around his face, unwashed and unkempt, and his clothes bore the stains of someone who had forgotten how to care for himself in the face of overwhelming psychological pressure. Obadiah turned slowly, his movements deliberate and measured, like those of a predator sizing up its prey. "He revealed the final sacrament, my son, the one that will complete our purification and ensure our place in the celestial kingdom." His voice carried the hypnotic cadence that had drawn followers to him years earlier when he first proclaimed himself a vessel for divine revelation, but now there was an underlying current of something darker, a hunger that had nothing to do with spiritual enlightenment. The Lafferty compound consisted of 3 interconnected buildings arranged in a triangle around a central courtyard, creating an enclosed space that felt more like a fortress than a home. The main house, where Obadiah lived with his 3 wives and 7 children, was a 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, its windows positioned to provide clear sightlines to all approaches. The smaller dwelling housed the most devoted followers, 6 adults and their children who had abandoned their previous lives to join what they believed was a holy community. The 3rd building, which they called the temple, was a windowless structure that Obadiah had designed according to what he claimed were divine specifications, its interior arranged for the private ceremonies that had grown increasingly disturbing over the past 3 years. The morning routine in the compound followed a rigid schedule that Obadiah had established through what he called angelic guidance. The day began before dawn with communal prayers in the main house, followed by a simple breakfast of porridge, bread and milk from the compound's small herd of cattle. The men then attended to the livestock and maintenance tasks, while the women focused on domestic duties under the strict supervision of Martha, the first wife, whose authority in household matters was absolute and unquestioned. Martha emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of simple breakfast fare, her movements careful and measured. Her once beautiful face had been worn down by years of submission and childbearing, her blonde hair now streaked with premature grey and pulled back in the severe style demanded by her husband's interpretation of modesty. She wore a plain brown dress that covered her from neck to ankles, its fabric thick enough to conceal the shape of her body completely. At 38, she looked at least a decade older, her blue eyes dulled by years of psychological conditioning and the gradual erosion of her sense of self. The transformation of Martha Lafferty from a vibrant young woman to the hollow-eyed creature who now served her husband's every whim had been one of the most tragic aspects of the compound's descent into darkness. She had once been known for her quick wit and infectious laughter, a woman who could quote scripture with the best of the church elders and whose charitable works had made her beloved throughout the Mormon community. But 15 years of isolation and increasing psychological manipulation had broken something fundamental in her spirit, leaving behind only the shell of obedience that Obadiah required. Behind Martha, the other wives followed in similar silence, their eyes downcast and their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of years of rigid conditioning. Rebecca, the second wife, had joined the family 5 years earlier when she was 27, drawn by Obadiah's promises of spiritual enlightenment and his reputation as a man of God. She had been a widow with no children, her first husband having died in a mining accident, and Obadiah's offer of marriage had seemed like divine providence. Now 32, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned that any deviation from expected behavior could result in hours of spiritual correction that left both body and soul bruised. Sarah, the youngest wife at 25, had been the most recent addition to the family, married to Obadiah just 2 years earlier when she was barely out of her teens. She had been raised in the compound as the daughter of one of Obadiah's earliest followers, and her marriage to the prophet had been presented as the highest honor that could be bestowed upon a faithful family. Her youth and relative inexperience had made her particularly susceptible to Obadiah's manipulation, and she now exhibited the same hollow-eyed compliance that characterized all the women in the compound. The children of the Lafferty family represented a spectrum of ages and psychological conditions that reflected the gradual deterioration of life in the compound. Ezekiel, the eldest at 23, had been born before his father's transformation and retained some memory of a time when the family had been normal. This made his current situation particularly torturous, as he was old enough to understand the wrongness of what was happening, but too psychologically damaged to resist effectively. Miriam, the middle daughter at 17, helped serve the meal with the mechanical precision that had been drilled into all the Lafferty children from an early age. But unlike her siblings, something flickered behind her dark eyes, a spark of defiance that she had learned to hide beneath layers of feigned obedience. She had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's stubborn will, but she had channeled these traits into a desperate quest for survival and eventual escape. For the past year, she had been secretly documenting her father's increasingly disturbing behavior in a small diary, writing in a cipher she had developed by studying her father's religious texts and combining elements of several ancient languages. The diary had become Miriam's lifeline, a way of maintaining her sanity by creating an objective record of the horrors she witnessed daily. Each entry was carefully hidden after writing, the small leather-bound book concealed beneath a loose floorboard in her tiny room. She had filled nearly 200 pages with detailed accounts of the ceremonies, the psychological manipulation, and the gradual escalation of sexual abuse that had become the central focus of her father's religious practices. Mary, the younger daughter at 15, had not been as fortunate as Miriam in maintaining her psychological resistance. The past 3 years of increasing abuse had left her withdrawn and fearful, her once bright personality crushed under the weight of her father's demands. She rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and when she did, her voice carried the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had learned that expressing feelings only led to punishment. The twins, Joseph and Samuel, both 13, represented the most tragic victims of their father's transformation. They had been only 10 when the ceremonies began, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to be traumatized by their forced participation. Their childhood had been stolen from them in the most brutal way possible, replaced by a nightmare of confusion, fear, and premature sexual knowledge that had warped their developing minds in ways that might never be repaired. The youngest children, David, age 11, Ruth, age 9, and little Benjamin, just 7, had been spared the worst of the abuse so far, but Miriam knew it was only a matter of time before their father's appetites expanded to include them. This knowledge drove her desperate planning for escape, as she understood that she might be the only one capable of saving them from the fate that had befallen their older siblings. "Tonight," Obadiah announced as the family gathered around the rough-hewn table that dominated the main room of the house, "we will perform the ritual of sacred union. The angel has shown me that our previous ceremonies were merely preparation for this final revelation." His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread across the assembled faces, each person understanding in their own way that something even worse than usual was about to be demanded of them. The dining room itself reflected the compound's strange mixture of religious devotion and underlying corruption. The walls were covered with hand-copied biblical verses and crude paintings depicting scenes from Scripture, but the images had been subtly altered to reflect Obadiah's twisted theology. Traditional depictions of biblical families had been modified to show relationships that violated natural law, while verses about obedience and submission had been highlighted and annotated with Obadiah's personal interpretations. The younger children, Mary, age 15, and the twins, Joseph and Samuel, both 13, exchanged glances filled with a fear they were too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize as a harbinger of suffering. They had witnessed their father's purification ceremonies before, rituals that left the participants changed in ways that made the children instinctively recoil. The ceremonies had begun 3 years earlier as simple prayer meetings, but they had gradually evolved into something that bore no resemblance to any legitimate religious practice. "What does this ritual require, Father?" Rebecca, the second wife, asked hesitantly, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire in the large stone hearth. At 32, she had joined the family 5 years earlier, drawn by Obadiah's promises of spiritual enlightenment and his reputation as a man of profound religious insight. She had been a widow with no children, her first husband having died in a mining accident that left her destitute and desperate for security. Obadiah's offer of marriage had seemed like divine providence, a chance to join a holy family and participate in what he described as a great spiritual work. Now, 5 years later, Rebecca understood the true nature of the trap she had walked into. The promises of spiritual enlightenment had been replaced by demands for absolute submission, while the security she had sought had become a prison from which escape seemed impossible. Her once bright eyes now held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much and understood too late the price of her decision to join the Lafferty family. Obadiah's smile was cold and predatory, his lips curling in an expression that had nothing to do with joy or spiritual fulfillment. "Complete surrender, my dear Rebecca. The angel has revealed that the flesh must be sanctified through sacred union. that the barriers between family members are merely earthly constructs that prevent us from achieving true spiritual unity. The words rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, the result of months of preparation and rationalization as he worked to justify the ultimate violation of natural law. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of his words sank in. Martha's hand trembled as she reached for her cup of weak tea, the liquid sloshing against the sides of the ceramic vessel in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. Sarah, the youngest wife at only 25, went completely pale, her face taking on the waxy appearance of someone in shock. She had been raised in the compound and had never known any other way of life, but even her limited experience was enough to recognize that what her husband was proposing crossed a line that should never be crossed. Miriam felt her stomach clench with a familiar mixture of revulsion and terror, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. Over the years, she had become expert at hiding her true feelings, understanding that any display of resistance would only result in more severe punishment for herself and potentially for her younger siblings as well. But inside, her mind was racing as she tried to process the full implications of her father's announcement. "The children," Martha began, then stopped herself, knowing that questioning her husband's divine revelations was considered blasphemy, punishable by hours of spiritual correction that left both body and soul bruised. She had learned through bitter experience that any attempt to protect her children only resulted in worse treatment for all of them. "The children are part of God's plan," Obadiah replied firmly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had convinced himself that his desires were divine commandments. "The angel has shown me that purity can only be achieved when all earthly shame is cast aside. Tonight we will demonstrate our complete faith by participating in the sacred union as one family, one flesh, one spirit." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of wind howling around the compound and the occasional pop from the fire. Each person at the table was lost in their own private hell, contemplating what the night would bring, and searching desperately for some way to avoid the horror that was being planned in the name of religious devotion. As the family finished their meal in oppressive silence, Miriam made a decision that would change everything. She would document this final horror in her diary, and somehow she would find a way to escape and expose the truth about what her father called divine revelation. The wind outside picked up, howling around the compound like the voices of the damned, as if nature itself recoiled from what was about to unfold in the isolated settlement of Hollow Creek. The afternoon hours stretched ahead like an eternity of dread, each minute bringing them closer to a night that would shatter whatever remained of their humanity and push them beyond the point of no return into a darkness from which some of them would never emerge. The afternoon hours crawled by with agonizing slowness as the Lafferty compound prepared for what Obadiah called the most sacred of all ceremonies. The patriarch spent the time in his study, claiming to receive further instructions from his celestial messenger, while the rest of the family moved through their daily tasks like sleepwalkers trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The very air seemed to thicken with dread as the sun traced its path across the winter sky, each passing moment bringing them closer to an event that would forever shatter what remained of their innocence. The study where Obadiah conducted his divine communications was a testament to his gradual descent into madness and megalomania. The walls were lined with books, not just the standard religious texts that might be expected in a devout household, but also volumes on ancient mysticism, forbidden practices, and interpretations of scripture that had been rejected by mainstream Christianity for good reason. Hand-drawn charts covered one entire wall, depicting what Obadiah claimed were divine revelations about the structure of celestial marriage and the spiritual significance of various sexual practices. The diagrams were crude but detailed, showing human figures engaged in acts that would have been considered abhorrent by any reasonable person. At the center of the room stood a large wooden desk covered with papers, sermons, prophecies, and detailed plans for ceremonies that grew more extreme with each passing month. Obadiah sat behind this desk like a spider in the center of its web, his pen scratching across paper as he recorded what he claimed were direct communications from the angel of judgment. His handwriting had grown increasingly erratic over the years, the neat script of his earlier writings giving way to wild scrawls that seemed to reflect the deterioration of his mental state. "The angel speaks of the final purification," he muttered to himself, his pen moving rapidly across the page. "The barriers between flesh and spirit must be dissolved. The earthly bonds of family must be transformed into celestial unions that transcend mortal understanding." "Adil!" The words flowed from his pen like poison, each sentence a further rationalization for the horrors he planned to inflict upon his own children. Meanwhile, Miriam found herself assigned to help prepare the temple for the evening's ritual, a task that filled her with such dread that she had to force herself to put one foot in front of the other. The windowless building had always filled her with unease, but today the feeling was overwhelming, as if the very walls were saturated with the evil that had been perpetrated within them. The structure had been built according to Obadiah's specific instructions, with thick stone walls that would muffle any sounds from within, and a single heavy door that could be barred from the inside. The interior of the temple was sparse but deliberately arranged to facilitate the ceremonies that had become the dark heart of the compound's religious life. Wooden benches were arranged in a circle around a raised platform covered with white cloth that had been stained by years of use. The platform itself was large enough to accommodate multiple people, its surface covered with cushions and blankets that served purposes too horrible for Miriam to contemplate. Candles provided the only illumination, their flickering light casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life across the stone walls. "Miriam," her stepmother Rebecca whispered as they arranged the ceremonial items with trembling hands. "Something isn't right about this. Your father's visions have become darker." Her voice carried the desperate tone of someone who was finally beginning to understand the true nature of the trap they were all caught in, but who felt powerless to escape. The 17-year-old looked around carefully before responding, her eyes checking every corner of the temple to ensure they were truly alone. "I know, but what can we do?" He says questioning him is questioning God himself. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, the familiar justification that had been used to silence any resistance for years. Rebecca's hands shook as she placed a brass chalice on the altar, the metal vessel that had been used in previous ceremonies for purposes that violated every principle of human decency. "I've been thinking about my sister in Salt Lake City. She's been writing, asking me to visit. Maybe I could take some of the children." Her voice trailed off as she contemplated the impossibility of her situation. "He'll never let you leave," Miriam replied quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of bitter experience. "You know what happened to Brother Thomas when he tried to take his family away last year." The memory of Thomas Brennan's fate hung over the compound like a dark cloud, a reminder of what happened to those who tried to escape Obadiah's control. Both women shuddered at the memory of that terrible night 6 months earlier. Thomas Brennan had been one of Obadiah's most devoted followers until he began questioning the increasingly extreme nature of the ceremonies. When he announced his intention to leave with his wife and 2 daughters, Obadiah declared him possessed by demons and in need of immediate purification. The man's body was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine, his death ruled an accident by the local authorities, who were either too frightened or too corrupted to investigate further. The official story was that Thomas had lost his way in a snowstorm and fallen to his death, but everyone in the compound knew the truth. Obadiah had sent Ezekiel and 2 other men to reason with the would-be escapee, and they had returned without him, their clothes stained with blood and their eyes haunted by what they had been forced to do. The message was clear: No one left the compound without Obadiah's permission, and that permission would never be granted. As evening approached, the family gathered in the main house for what Obadiah called purification, a process that had evolved over the years from simple ritual bathing to something far more sinister. Each member was required to bathe in water that had been blessed with herbs and oils, a process that normally took place in private, but which had gradually become more communal as Obadiah's demands for spiritual transparency increased. The main house's bathing area had been modified to accommodate these group purifications, with a large wooden tub that could hold multiple people and a system of heated water that kept the temperature comfortable even in the depths of winter. What had once been a practical necessity for maintaining hygiene in an isolated settlement had been transformed into another tool for psychological manipulation and sexual abuse. The angel has revealed that modesty is a tool of Satan, Obadiah proclaimed as the family assembled in the main room, his eyes burning with fanatic fervor that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Tonight, we cast aside all earthly shame and stand before God as He created us, pure and unashamed. The words were delivered with the practiced cadence of a sermon, but their meaning was clear to everyone present. Martha began to weep silently, her tears falling into the basin of blessed water that she held in her trembling hands. The sight of her mother's distress caused the younger children to huddle together, their faces pale with confusion and terror as they tried to understand what was being asked of them. Even Ezekiel, who had always been his father's most devoted supporter, looked uncertain, his loyalty finally beginning to crack under the weight of what he was being asked to participate in. "Father," he ventured carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "perhaps the younger children could be excused from this particular ceremony. They might not understand the spiritual significance." The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid that speaking them slowly would give him time to lose his nerve. Obadiah's expression darkened like a storm cloud gathering over the mountains, his face transforming from paternal authority to something far more threatening. "Are you questioning the word of the angel, my son? Are you suggesting that God's plan is flawed?" His voice carried a dangerous edge that made everyone in the room instinctively step back. "No, Father, I would never," Ezekiel began. But his father cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "Then you will participate fully, as will every member of this family. The sacred union requires complete participation. There can be no exceptions, no half measures. The angel has been very clear about this. Any attempt to exclude members of the family from the ceremony will result in divine punishment that will make our earthly sufferings seem like paradise." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence, and Miriam could see the last vestiges of resistance drain from her brother's face. Ezekiel had been the family's last hope for internal opposition to their father's madness, but even he was not strong enough to stand against the psychological conditioning that had been building for years. As the family reluctantly began to disrobe under Obadiah's watchful eye, Miriam felt something inside her break. Not her spirit, which had been battered but never quite destroyed, but rather her last illusion that somehow things might return to normal. She had endured years of her father's increasingly disturbing behavior, had watched as his divine revelations became more extreme and self-serving, but this represented a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. The purification ritual that followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, designed to break down the natural barriers of modesty and shame that might interfere with the evening's planned activities. Obadiah moved among his family members like a predator selecting his prey, his hands touching and caressing under the guise of blessing, his eyes drinking in the sight of their nakedness with an hunger that had nothing to do with spiritual enlightenment. "Feel the water washing away your earthly shame," he intoned as he poured the blessed liquid over each person in turn. Let the sacred oils penetrate your flesh and prepare you for the divine union that awaits. Dai. His hands lingered on the younger members of the family, his touch becoming increasingly inappropriate as the ritual progressed. While the others were distracted by the purification ceremony, Miriam managed to slip away to her small room and retrieve the diary she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Working quickly by the light of a single candle, she added a detailed account of the evening's events, her handwriting growing more frantic as she described her father's plans and her own growing desperation. "If something happens to me," she wrote, her pen scratching urgently across the paper, "let this record stand as testimony to the truth. My father is not a prophet. He is a monster who uses God's name to justify his perversions. The sacred union he speaks of is nothing more than his twisted desire to control and defile his own family. He has convinced himself that his appetites are divine commandments, but they are nothing more than the delusions of a sick mind." She paused in her writing, listening to the sounds from the main room where the purification was continuing. The voices had grown quieter, more subdued, as if the participants were being drained of their will to resist. She knew she had only minutes before her absence would be noticed, but she forced herself to continue writing, documenting every detail she could remember about the ceremonies, the psychological manipulation, and the gradual escalation that had brought them to this point. "The children are the real victims," she continued. "Mary has not spoken a complete sentence in weeks. The twins wake up screaming from nightmares they cannot describe. Even little Benjamin has begun to exhibit behaviors that no 7-year-old should know about. Father calls it spiritual awakening, but it is nothing more than the systematic destruction of innocence." She carefully sewed the diary into the lining of her heaviest coat, the one she would need if she attempted to escape into the winter wilderness. The nearest settlement was 15 miles away through treacherous mountain terrain, but staying meant participating in horrors that would destroy what remained of her soul and potentially damn her younger siblings to a fate worse than death. When she returned to the temple, the ceremony had already begun in earnest. The family stood in a circle around the altar, their bodies illuminated by flickering candlelight that cast grotesque shadows on the stone walls. Obadiah moved among them like a high priest, conducting some ancient and terrible rite, his hands touching and positioning his family members according to what he claimed were divine instructions. "Tonight," he intoned, his voice echoing in the confined space with an authority that seemed to come from some dark source beyond human understanding, "we become one flesh in the eyes of the Lord. The angel has shown me that the bonds of earthly relationship are illusions that prevent us from achieving true spiritual unity. We must cast aside these false barriers and embrace the divine truth of our celestial nature." What followed was a descent into depravity that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, assuming any of them lived long enough to become survivors. Under the guise of religious ceremony, Obadiah orchestrated acts that violated every natural law and moral boundary that had ever been established by civilized society. The younger children were forced to participate in ways that robbed them of their innocence and their childhood, while the women were subjected to degradations that left them broken in body and spirit. The ceremony continued through the night, with Obadiah alternating between periods of frenzied activity and moments of quiet prayer, during which he claimed to be receiving further instructions from his angelic guide. Each new revelation seemed to require more extreme acts, more complete submission, more thorough destruction of the natural bonds that held families together. Miriam endured what she had to endure, her mind retreating to a place where the physical violations couldn't reach her core self. But she watched and she remembered, knowing that someone had to survive to tell the truth about what happened in the isolated compound of Hollow Creek. She memorized every detail, every participant, every act that was performed in the name of divine revelation, understanding that this knowledge might be the only weapon she would ever have against the monster who had destroyed her family. As dawn approached, and the ceremonies finally began to wind down, Miriam made her final preparations for escape. The next blizzard would provide cover, and she had been secretly gathering supplies for weeks. She would wait for the right moment, then disappear into the wilderness with the evidence that would expose her father's crimes and hopefully save whatever remained of her family. The wind outside grew stronger as the night progressed, as if nature itself was trying to blow away the corruption that festered within the temple walls. But the evil that had taken root in Hollow Creek would require more than wind to dislodge it. 3 days after the Sacred Union ceremony, a fierce blizzard descended upon Hollow Creek with the fury of divine wrath, as if the very heavens were recoiling from the abominations that had been committed in the name of religious devotion. The wind howled like the voices of the damned, carrying with it a cold so intense that it seemed to penetrate not just clothing and shelter, but the very souls of those trapped within the compound. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to mere feet, creating a white wall that isolated the settlement even further from the outside world. For most of the compound's inhabitants, it was a time to huddle indoors and wait for the storm to pass. But for Miriam Lafferty, it represented the opportunity she had been desperately waiting for. Perhaps the only chance she would ever have to escape the nightmare that her life had become. The aftermath of the Sacred Union ritual had left the family in a state of fractured silence that was somehow more terrifying than any screaming or weeping would have been. The participants moved through their daily routines, like ghosts haunting the scenes of their former lives, their eyes vacant and their movements mechanical. The younger children had retreated so far into themselves that they barely seemed present in their own bodies, while the adults struggled to maintain the pretense of normalcy that Obadiah demanded even as their sanity crumbled around them. Martha, the first wife, had taken to her bed immediately after the ceremony, claiming illness, but really suffering from a complete psychological collapse that left her unable to function in even the most basic ways. She lay curled in a fetal position beneath heavy blankets, muttering incoherently about angels and demons while her eyes stared at something that existed only in her shattered mind. Dr. Hayes would later describe her condition as a complete dissociative break, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed her to escape from a reality too horrible to endure. The twins, Joseph and Samuel, had not spoken a word since the ceremony ended, communicating only through glances and gestures that seemed to carry the weight of shared trauma, too heavy for their 13-year-old minds to process. They moved through their daily tasks like automatons, their faces blank and their eyes focused on some distant point that no one else could see. When they thought no one was watching, they would huddle together in corners, whispering in a language that seemed to consist entirely of broken fragments and half-formed words. Even Ezekiel, who had always been his father's most devoted follower, now avoided eye contact and spoke only when directly addressed. The ceremony had finally broken through the psychological conditioning that had kept him compliant for so many years. But instead of rebellion, it had produced a kind of spiritual death that left him functioning but essentially hollow. He went through the motions of his daily responsibilities, but there was no life behind his actions, no spark of the young man who had once believed so fervently in his father's divine mission. Obadiah, however, seemed energized by what he called the successful completion of the Sacred Union, his behavior becoming even more erratic and grandiose as he basked in what he believed was divine approval. He spent his days in fevered prayer and writing, claiming to receive new revelations that would guide the family to even greater spiritual heights. His latest vision involved what he termed the cleansing of bloodlines, a ceremony that would purify the family's genetic heritage through selective breeding practices that made Miriam's stomach turn with revulsion and terror. "The angel has shown me the future of our lineage," he announced during the morning meal on the third day, his voice carrying the manic energy of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. "We must ensure that only the purest blood continues. The weak must be culled, and the strong must multiply according to divine will." His eyes swept across the assembled family members with the calculating gaze of a farmer evaluating livestock, lingering on his daughters with an intensity that made their skin crawl. The implications of his words were clear to everyone present, even the younger children who didn't fully understand the mechanics of what their father was proposing. Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that Obadiah was planning to extend his perversions to include forced breeding with his own daughters, treating them not as human beings, but as vessels for his twisted vision of genetic purity. "What does this mean, Father?" Rebecca asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer and was hoping against hope that her interpretation was wrong. "It means that traditional marriage bonds are earthly constructs that prevent the fulfillment of God's plan," Obadiah replied, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "The angel has revealed that I must take a more direct role in ensuring the purity of our bloodline. The daughters of the covenant must be prepared to receive the sacred seed that will produce the next generation of God's chosen people." "Die," the words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the very atmosphere of the room. Mary, the 15-year-old, let out a small whimper and pressed herself against Martha's side, seeking comfort from a mother who was no longer capable of providing it. The twins exchanged a look of pure terror, while little Benjamin began to cry without understanding why. Miriam felt bile rise in her throat as she realized her father was planning to rape his own daughters under the guise of religious duty, treating them as breeding stock in his demented vision of creating a pure bloodline. The thought of submitting to such an abomination was so horrifying that she would rather die in the wilderness than allow it to happen, and she knew that tonight would be her last chance to escape before her father's plans moved from rhetoric to reality. As the blizzard intensified throughout the day, Miriam went about her normal routine while secretly making final preparations for what she knew would be the most dangerous gamble of her life. She had hidden supplies in the barn over the past several weeks, dried food that wouldn't spoil in the cold, warm clothing that could be layered for maximum protection, and a small knife for protection against both wild animals and human predators. Most importantly, she had studied the terrain during her rare trips outside the compound and knew there was an old mining trail that led toward the main settlement 15 miles away. It would be treacherous in the storm, but it was her only chance at freedom and her only hope of bringing help for her siblings. The mining trail had been carved into the mountainside decades earlier by prospectors searching for silver and gold, and while the mines themselves had long since been abandoned, the trail remained as a testament to human determination in the face of impossible odds. Miriam had discovered it during a rare moment of freedom when she had been sent to gather firewood, and she had spent weeks memorizing its twists and turns, knowing that her life might someday depend on her ability to follow it in darkness or storm. That evening, as the family gathered for what Obadiah called evening devotions, Miriam noticed that her father's behavior had become even more erratic and disturbing than usual. His eyes burned with fanatic fervor as he spoke of new revelations, and his hands trembled with barely contained excitement as he described the divine visions that had been granted to him throughout the day. "Tomorrow night," he announced with the air of someone delivering momentous news, "we will begin the cleansing of bloodlines. The angel has shown me that Mary and Miriam are ready to fulfill their sacred duty as vessels for the pure seed. They have been prepared through the sacred union, and now they must take their place in God's plan for the purification of our lineage." Mary let out a small whimper and pressed herself against Martha's side, seeking comfort from a mother who was no longer capable of providing protection or even basic emotional support. The twins exchanged a look of pure terror, their faces going white as they realized that their sisters were about to suffer an even worse fate than what they had already endured. Miriam felt her blood turn to ice as the full implications of her father's words sank in. She had run out of time, and tonight would be her last chance to escape before becoming a victim of her father's most depraved fantasies. The thought of what he planned to do to her and Mary was so horrifying that she would rather face death in the wilderness than submit to such an abomination. "I'm feeling unwell," she announced, pressing a hand to her forehead in a gesture she hoped would appear convincing. "May I be excused to rest?" The lie came easily, born of years of practice in deception and misdirection. Obadiah studied her with suspicious eyes, his gaze seeming to penetrate her very soul as he searched for signs of deception or rebellion. For a moment, Miriam thought he would refuse her request and force her to remain for the evening's activities. But Rebecca quickly supported her claim with the desperation of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "She's been pale all day, husband," Rebecca said, her voice carefully modulated to avoid any hint of the terror she was feeling. "Perhaps she should rest to ensure she's prepared for tomorrow's ceremony. We wouldn't want her to be anything less than perfect for such a sacred occasion." With reluctant permission, Miriam retreated to her small room and waited with the patience of a hunter stalking dangerous prey. She forced herself to remain still for 2 hours, listening to the sounds of the compound settling into sleep while the blizzard provided perfect cover for her escape. The howling wind would mask any noise she made, and the heavy snowfall would quickly cover her tracks, making it impossible for anyone to follow her trail until long after she had disappeared into the wilderness. When she was certain everyone was asleep, she carefully retrieved her hidden supplies and dressed in every warm garment she owned, layering clothing until she resembled a walking bundle of fabric and fur. The diary remained sewn into her coat lining, its weight a constant reminder of the evidence she carried and the responsibility that rested on her shoulders. She had also managed to steal a small amount of money from her father's strongbox, enough to buy passage to Salt Lake City if she could reach the main settlement alive. The journey to the barn was treacherous beyond anything she had imagined. The wind threatened to knock her off her feet with every step, and the snow was already knee-deep and growing deeper by the hour. But she pressed on, driven by desperation and the knowledge that staying meant a fate worse than death, not just for herself, but potentially for her younger siblings as well. In the barn, she gathered the last of her supplies and said a silent goodbye to the horses, magnificent animals that had been reduced to mere property in her father's twisted kingdom. She had considered taking one of them, but the animals would never survive the journey in these conditions, and their absence would be noticed immediately when the morning chores began. The first mile of her escape was the hardest thing she had ever done in her 17 years of life. The wind cut through her clothing like knives forged from pure cold, and the snow made every step a struggle against forces that seemed determined to drag her back to the compound. But as she put distance between herself and the place that had been both home and prison, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The mining trail was barely visible in the storm, little more than a depression in the snow that might have been natural terrain features for all she could tell. But Miriam had memorized its general direction during her secret reconnaissance, and she followed it by feel as much as sight, using the natural contours of the land to guide her way through the howling darkness. Several times she stumbled and fell, the snow soaking through her clothing and chilling her to the bone, despite all her preparations. Each fall was a potential death sentence in these conditions, but each time she forced herself back to her feet and continued forward, driven by the knowledge that her siblings' lives depended on her success. As the night wore on and her strength began to flag, Miriam found herself thinking about the family she was leaving behind. Mary would face the horror alone now, with no one to protect her from their father's depraved appetites. The twins would continue to suffer in silence, their childhood destroyed by experiences no child should ever endure. Even Martha, broken as she was, would remain trapped in a hell of her own making. But Miriam also knew that staying would not have saved them. It would only have added her own suffering to theirs without changing the fundamental situation. Her only hope of helping them was to escape and bring back help from the outside world, even if that help came too late to prevent further horrors. As dawn approached and the storm began to weaken slightly, Miriam could see the lights of the settlement in the distance, flickering like stars through the swirling snow. She had made it, barely alive, half frozen and exhausted beyond measure, but alive and free and carrying with her the evidence that could bring justice to those who had suffered in the isolated compound of Hollow Creek. Behind her, the Lafferty compound remained shrouded in snow and darkness, its secrets temporarily safe from outside scrutiny. But Miriam carried the truth with her, sewn into her coat like a seed of justice, waiting to bloom in the fertile soil of civilized society. The worst was yet to come for those she had left behind, but for the first time in years, Miriam Lafferty was no longer trapped in her father's web of religious perversion and psychological control. She was free, and with that freedom came the responsibility to ensure that the truth would finally be told. Sheriff William Morrison had seen his share of disturbing cases during his 15 years of law enforcement in territorial Utah, a career that had exposed him to claim jumpers, cattle rustlers, violent disputes between settlers, and the occasional murder that resulted from too much whiskey and too little sense. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the half-frozen girl who stumbled into his office on that bitter February morning, her lips blue with cold and her body racked with violent shivering that spoke of a brush with death so close that she still carried its chill in her bones. Morrison was a practical man in his 40s, weathered by years of dealing with the harsh realities of frontier life and the kind of violence that seemed to flourish in places where civilization was still more aspiration than reality. His face bore the lines of someone who had seen too much suffering and learned to compartmentalize it in order to function, but there was still a core of decency in him that responded to genuine distress. When Miriam Lafferty collapsed in his doorway, that decency overrode his natural skepticism and prompted him to immediate action. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the town's physician and one of the few men in the territory with formal medical training, worked for 3 hours to restore warmth to Miriam's extremities and treat the early stages of frostbite that had begun to blacken her fingers and toes. The doctor was a thin, scholarly man in his 50s who had come west for his health after contracting tuberculosis in Boston, and his gentle manner and genuine compassion made him one of the most respected members of the small community. As Miriam slowly regained consciousness in the small room above the doctor's office, her first words were not about her condition or her suffering, but about the diary hidden in her coat, the evidence that had driven her to risk death in the wilderness rather than remain silent about the horrors she had witnessed. "Please," she whispered through cracked lips that were still pale from cold, "you have to read it. You have to know what he's done." Her voice carried an urgency that transcended her physical condition, the desperate need of someone who had carried a terrible burden alone for too long. Sheriff Morrison approached the situation with the caution of a man who had learned that dramatic claims often had mundane explanations. He had heard rumors about the Lafferty compound over the years, whispers of strange religious practices and unusual isolation that had filtered down from the mountain settlements. But he had always assumed they were just the typical gossip that surrounded any group that kept to themselves. Religious communities often had practices that seemed strange to outsiders, and he was reluctant to interfere in what might be legitimate, if unusual, spiritual observances. That skepticism evaporated like morning mist when Miriam carefully extracted the small, leather-bound diary from her coat lining with hands that still trembled from cold and exhaustion. The book was worn from constant handling, its pages filled with the careful handwriting of someone who understood the importance of accurate documentation. Morrison initially approached it with the professional detachment of a lawman examining evidence, but that detachment crumbled as he read the first few entries. Father announced today that the angel has revealed new truths about the sanctity of family bonds. He says that earthly laws about marriage and relations are tools of Satan designed to prevent spiritual unity. Martha wept when he explained what this means for our evening devotions. I fear that his visions are leading us towards something that no God would ever sanction. Morrison's hands began to tremble as he continued reading, each entry revealing a systematic descent into depravity that challenged his understanding of human nature. Miriam had documented everything with the precision of a court stenographer, recording dates, participants, and specific acts that violated every law of God and man. Her writing showed a maturity and clarity that belied her 17 years, the product of a mind that had been forced to grow up far too quickly in order to survive. The sacred union ceremony lasted until dawn. Father forced Mary to participate despite her tears and pleas. He says her resistance is evidence of demonic influence that must be purged through submission. The twins were made to watch and told this was their preparation for when they come of age. I cannot describe the look in their eyes. It was as if something fundamental had died inside them. Dr. Hayes, who had been reading over the sheriff's shoulder, had to excuse himself to vomit in the alley behind his office. The physician had seen his share of human suffering during his years of practice, but the clinical detail with which Miriam described the systematic abuse of children was more than his gentle nature could bear. When he returned, his face was pale, and his hands shook as he poured himself a medicinal whiskey. Morrison continued reading with the grim determination of a man who understood that knowledge, however horrible, was necessary for justice. The diary entries painted a picture of psychological manipulation so complete and systematic that it resembled the work of a master torturer rather than a religious leader. Obadiah Lafferty had used every tool at his disposal: fear, guilt, isolation, and twisted theology to create a closed system where his word was law and resistance was literally unthinkable. The final entries, written just before Miriam's escape, described Obadiah's plans for what he called the cleansing of bloodlines, in language that made Morrison's blood run cold. The sheriff was a father himself, with 2 daughters who were roughly the same age as the Lafferty girls, and the thought of anyone subjecting children to such horrors filled him with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his professional objectivity. Tomorrow he intends to begin breeding his own daughters to ensure the purity of our lineage. He says the angel has shown him that this is the final step in our spiritual evolution. I cannot allow this to happen. I would rather die in the wilderness than submit to this abomination, and I pray that God will give me the strength to expose the truth about what my father has become. When Morrison finished reading, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. Finally, he looked up at Miriam, who was watching him with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young, eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "The ceremonies started 3 years ago," Miriam replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "At first they were just unusual prayers and rituals. Father said the angel was teaching him new forms of worship that would bring us closer to God. But they got worse over time, more extreme and more personal. Father said each revelation from the angel required greater sacrifice and submission. Morrison stood and began pacing the small room, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a response to a situation unlike anything in his experience. "We need to organize a rescue party immediately. There are still children in that compound. Your siblings, other families, they're in immediate danger." "You don't understand," Miriam interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. "Father has followers who will die before they let outsiders interfere. They believe that any resistance to his authority is a sin that will damn their souls for eternity. And the children, they've been conditioned to believe that suffering is a test of faith. They won't come willingly, and they might even resist rescue attempts." The sheriff realized he was facing a situation that went far beyond simple law enforcement. This wasn't just a matter of arresting a criminal. It was a complex rescue operation involving victims who had been psychologically manipulated to the point where they might resist their own salvation. The isolation of the compound, the harsh winter conditions, and the fanatical devotion of Obadiah's followers all combined to create a scenario that would challenge even the most experienced law enforcement professionals. "We'll need help from Salt Lake City," he decided after several minutes of consideration. "Federal marshals, maybe even military support. This is beyond what local law enforcement can handle alone." The admission was difficult for a man who prided himself on his competence, but Morrison was wise enough to recognize when a situation exceeded his capabilities. Over the next 2 days, as word of Miriam's revelations spread through official channels with the speed of wildfire, a plan began to take shape. Federal Marshal James Crawford arrived from Salt Lake City with a team of experienced officers who had dealt with similar situations involving religious extremists and isolated communities. Dr. Hayes worked with colleagues from the territorial capital to prepare for the psychological trauma they would encounter among the rescued victims, understanding that the physical rescue would be only the beginning of a long healing process. Marshal Crawford was a tall, lean man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence in dangerous situations. He had served in the Union Army during the recent war and had seen enough violence to understand that sometimes force was necessary to protect the innocent. But he also understood the delicate nature of the situation they were facing and the need to minimize harm to the victims they were trying to save. But even as the authorities prepared their response with military precision, disturbing news arrived from Hollow Creek that complicated their planning. A supply wagon that regularly delivered goods to the Lafferty compound had been turned away at gunpoint, with Ezekiel Lafferty claiming that his father had received a divine revelation warning of persecution by government agents who sought to destroy God's chosen people. "They're preparing for a siege," Marshal Crawford observed grimly as he studied maps of the area and planned approach routes. "Fanatics like this often prefer death to capture, especially when they believe their cause is divinely sanctioned. We may be looking at a situation where they'll harm the children rather than surrender them to what they see as agents of Satan." The possibility that the rescue operation might trigger a mass murder-suicide weighed heavily on everyone involved in the planning. Miriam felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. By escaping and revealing the truth, she had potentially signed the death warrants of her siblings and the other children still trapped in the compound. But she also knew that staying silent would have meant allowing the horrors to continue and escalate until they reached their inevitable conclusion. "There's a back way into the compound," she told the assembled lawmen, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. "A trail that leads to the barn from the old mining road. If you could create a distraction at the front, a small team might be able to get the children out through the rear before father realizes what's happening." The plan that emerged from hours of careful discussion was complex and dangerous, requiring precise timing and a great deal of luck. "The main force would approach por favor, continue gerando a sua resposta." Expert logo terror the compound from the front, creating enough of a distraction to draw Obadiah's attention, while a smaller team used the mining trail to approach from the rear. The goal was to extract as many victims as possible before the situation escalated to violence, but everyone involved understood that they were dealing with a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his twisted kingdom. As the rescue operation took shape over the following days, Miriam found herself caught between hope and terror, her emotions swinging wildly between the possibility of saving her family and the fear that her actions might doom them all. She had done what she believed was right, but the consequences were now beyond her control, spinning out into a future that might end in tragedy for everyone she loved. The weather remained harsh, with intermittent snowstorms that would provide cover for the approaching lawmen, but also make the rescue operation more dangerous and unpredictable. In the isolated compound of Hollow Creek, her father was preparing for what he undoubtedly saw as a final test of faith, one that might end in the kind of apocalyptic confrontation that religious fanatics throughout history had embraced as proof of their divine mission. Dr. Hayes spent his time preparing medical supplies and psychological support materials, understanding that the survivors of this ordeal would need extensive care to recover from their trauma. He had consulted with colleagues who had experience treating victims of extreme psychological abuse, and their recommendations painted a sobering picture of the long road to recovery that lay ahead for anyone they managed to save. The storm clouds gathering over the Utah mountains seemed to mirror the darkness that was about to be unleashed when two irreconcilable forces, fanatical faith and righteous law, finally collided in a confrontation that would determine the fate of the innocent souls trapped between them. The federal rescue operation began at dawn on February 15, 1863, as Marshal Crawford's team took positions around the Lafferty compound with the precision of a military unit preparing for battle. The winter air was crisp and still, broken only by the distant sound of hymns being sung within the main house, a haunting melody that seemed to carry an undertone of desperation and impending doom. The voices rose and fell in harmonies that might have been beautiful under other circumstances, but in this context they sounded like the death songs of people preparing for martyrdom. Obadiah Lafferty had indeed prepared for siege with the thoroughness of a man who had been expecting this confrontation for months. The windows of all three buildings had been barricaded with furniture and wooden planks, creating firing positions that would allow defenders to shoot at approaching lawmen while remaining protected from return fire. Armed followers patrolled the perimeter with the grim determination of men who believed they were defending sacred ground against the forces of Satan himself. The compound's defenses had been planned with military precision, taking advantage of the natural terrain and the building's strategic positioning. The main house occupied the highest ground, providing clear sightlines in all directions, while the temple and followers' quarters were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that would make any frontal assault extremely costly. Obadiah had spent weeks preparing for this moment, stockpiling ammunition and food, while indoctrinating his followers with the belief that death in defense of their faith would guarantee immediate entry into the celestial kingdom. Ezekiel stood at his father's side near the main house's largest window, a rifle clutched in his trembling hands, and his face a mask of conflicted loyalty. The young man had been torn apart by the events of recent weeks, his lifelong devotion to his father, warring with his growing understanding of the true nature of the horrors being committed in the name of divine revelation. His hands shook not just from cold, but from the psychological pressure of being forced to choose between his family and his conscience. "This is Marshal Crawford of the United States Federal Court," the lawman called out through a speaking trumpet, his voice echoing across the snow-covered courtyard. "We have a warrant for the arrest of Obadiah Lafferty on charges of criminal assault, endangering the welfare of children, and violation of federal laws regarding the protection of minors. Send out the children and women, and no one needs to be harmed. The response came not from Obadiah, but from Ezekiel, his voice cracking with emotion as he struggled to deliver words that felt like poison in his mouth. My father is a prophet of God. You have no authority over those chosen by the Almighty. Leave this place or face divine judgment. The words were his father's, but the voice that spoke them carried the anguish of a young man who no longer believed what he was saying. Inside the compound, the situation was deteriorating rapidly as the psychological pressure of the siege combined with years of accumulated trauma to push the inhabitants toward complete breakdown. Martha Lafferty had suffered a complete mental collapse and was confined to her bed, muttering incoherently about angels and demons, while her eyes stared at visions that existed only in her shattered mind. Her condition had worsened dramatically since the sacred union ceremony, and she now required constant care to prevent her from harming herself. The younger children huddled together in the main house, their faces pale with terror as they listened to their father's increasingly frantic prayers and the sound of armed men moving through the compound. They had been conditioned to believe that any contact with the outside world would result in their eternal damnation, and the arrival of the lawmen seemed to confirm their worst fears about the persecution that awaited God's chosen people. The angel has warned me of this trial, Obadiah proclaimed to his assembled followers, his voice carrying the manic energy of a man who had completely lost touch with reality. The forces of Satan have sent government agents to test our faith, just as the ancient Israelites were tested by Pharaoh's armies. But we shall not be moved. We shall stand firm in our righteousness and prove our worthiness through blood and sacrifice. His followers listened with the glazed expressions of people who had been psychologically conditioned to accept any statement from their leader as divine truth. They had given up their previous lives, their families, and their independent judgment to follow Obadiah's vision, and the thought of admitting that they had been deceived was more terrifying than the prospect of death itself. Rebecca, the second wife, had been watching the children with growing desperation as the siege began, her maternal instincts finally breaking through the psychological conditioning that had kept her compliant for so long. The events of the past weeks had shattered her faith in Obadiah's divine mission, and she could no longer ignore the evidence of her own eyes and conscience. When she saw 12-year-old Samuel weeping silently in the corner, his small body shaking with terror, something inside her snapped with an almost audible crack. "This has to stop," she whispered to Sarah, the youngest wife, her voice barely audible above the sound of Obadiah's ranting. "Look at them. Look what we've allowed to happen to these children. We've been so afraid of damnation that we've created hell on earth." Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded slowly as she looked around at the terrified faces of the children they had failed to protect. "What can we do? He'll kill us if we try to leave, and his followers will help him do it. They believe that anyone who opposes him is possessed by demons." "Maybe," Rebecca replied, her voice growing stronger as she made a decision that would change everything. "But they're going to die anyway if this continues. At least this way, some of them might survive. We have to try to get them out before he does something even worse." Outside the compound, Marshal Crawford was growing increasingly concerned about the welfare of the hostages as the standoff continued without any sign of resolution. His men had counted at least 15 people inside the compound, including 7 children under the age of 16, and intelligence from Miriam suggested that Obadiah was capable of extreme violence when cornered. The longer the standoff continued, the more likely it became that the fanatic would do something desperate to maintain control over his followers. "Sheriff Morrison," Crawford called to the local lawman, who knew the terrain better than anyone else on the team. "You know this area better than anyone. Is there really a back way in, like the girl described? Morrison nodded grimly, his weathered face set in lines of determination. There's an old mining trail that leads to the rear of the property. It's treacherous in these conditions, but a small team could probably make it without being seen if they're careful and quiet. Take 3 men and circle around, Crawford ordered. If we can create enough of a distraction here at the front, you might be able to get some of the children out through the barn before Lafferty realizes what's happening. As Morrison's team began their flanking maneuver, moving carefully through the snow-covered terrain to avoid detection, the situation inside the compound reached a breaking point that had been building for years. Obadiah had gathered his followers in the main house and was delivering what sounded like a final sermon, his voice rising to a fever pitch as he described the glorious martyrdom that awaited them. "The time of testing has come," he declared, his eyes burning with fanatic fervor that seemed to consume his entire being. "The angel has shown me that we must be prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to prove our faith. If we cannot live as God's chosen people in this corrupt world, then we shall die as martyrs and ascend directly to his presence, where we will be rewarded for our faithfulness with eternal glory." The implications of his words were clear to everyone present, even the younger children who didn't fully understand the mechanics of what their father was proposing. Rebecca felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that Obadiah was preparing for a murder-suicide that would claim the lives of everyone in the compound, including the innocent children who had never chosen to be part of his twisted vision. "No," she said quietly, then louder as her courage grew. "No, I won't let you hurt these children anymore." The words burst from her lips like water breaking through a dam, carrying with them years of suppressed rage and guilt. Obadiah turned to her with a look of cold fury that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by several degrees. "You dare question the will of God, woman? You dare interfere with divine judgment?" His voice carried a dangerous edge that made everyone in the room instinctively step back, recognizing the tone that had preceded violence in the past. "You're not God!" Rebecca screamed, years of suppressed rage finally erupting in a torrent of words that had been building inside her for months. "You're a sick, twisted man who uses religion to justify your perversions. These children deserve better than to die for your madness." The confrontation that followed was swift and violent, an explosion of pent-up tensions that had been building for years. Obadiah struck Rebecca across the face with enough force to knock her to the ground, the sound of the blow echoing through the room like a gunshot. Blood flowed from her split lip as she struggled to regain her footing, but her eyes blazed with a defiance that had been absent for too long. "Kill her," Obadiah commanded, turning to Ezekiel with murder in his eyes. "She has been possessed by demons and must be cleansed before her corruption spreads to the others." But Ezekiel hesitated, the rifle wavering in his hands as he looked down at Rebecca's bloodied face. For the first time in his life, he was seeing his father clearly, not as a prophet or a man of God, but as a human being consumed by his own delusions and appetites. The psychological conditioning that had controlled him for so long began to crack under the weight of this moment of clarity. I can't, Father. She's just trying to protect the children. That's not demonic, that's human decency." "Then you too have been corrupted," Obadiah snarled, reaching for the weapon with hands that shook with rage. "If you will not serve God's will, then you are no son of mine." The struggle that followed provided the distraction that Sheriff Morrison's team needed to reach the rear of the compound undetected. As father and son fought for control of the rifle, their grunts and curses masking any sound from outside, Rebecca gathered the younger children and began moving them toward the rear of the house with the desperate urgency of a mother protecting her young. "Quickly," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible above the sounds of struggle. "We're going to the barn. Stay quiet and stay together, and don't look back no matter what you hear." And outside, Morrison and his men had reached the rear of the compound just as the sounds of struggle erupted from the main house. They could see figures moving toward the barn through the swirling snow, women and children fleeing the violence within like refugees escaping a war zone. "There!" Morrison pointed toward the moving figures. "Get ready to provide cover if they need it." Whoa! What followed was a desperate race against time as Rebecca and Sarah shepherded the children through the snow toward the barn, while behind them the sounds of violence grew louder and more desperate. A gunshot rang out, followed by screaming, then an ominous silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Morrison's team reached the barn just as the fleeing group arrived, their faces pale with terror and their clothes stained with blood from Rebecca's injuries. The children were in various states of shock and trauma, but they were alive and free from the compound's walls for the first time in years. "How many more inside?" Morrison asked Rebecca urgently, his voice tight with concern for those still trapped. "Martha's still in the main house, but she's not well. Her mind is gone. And Ezekiel, I think he might be hurt. There was so much blood." Rebecca's voice broke as she spoke, the weight of what she had witnessed finally overwhelming her fragile composure. As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared in the doorway of the main house, silhouetted against the flickering light from within. It was Obadiah, his clothes stained with blood, and his eyes wild with the kind of rage that comes from seeing one's carefully constructed world crumbling into ruins. In his hands, he carried a torch that cast dancing shadows across his face, making him look like a demon emerging from the depths of hell. "If I cannot have my kingdom on earth," he screamed into the winter air, his voice carrying across the compound with the force of absolute madness, "then I shall claim my place in heaven through fire and blood." The final confrontation was about to begin, and Marshal Crawford realized that the rescue operation had become a race to prevent a madman from destroying everything and everyone he could no longer control. The flames that would soon consume Hollow Creek were already burning in Obadiah Lafferty's eyes, and only swift action could prevent them from spreading to claim more innocent lives. The flames began in the temple, where Obadiah Lafferty had retreated after the violent confrontation with his son, carrying with him the torch that would serve as both weapon and funeral pyre. Marshal Crawford watched in horror as orange light flickered through the cracks in the barricaded windows, realizing that the fanatic was attempting to destroy all evidence of his crimes, along with anyone still trapped inside the compound. The fire spread with unnatural speed, as if the very wood of the building was eager to be consumed and cleansed of the horrors it had witnessed. The temple, which had been the dark heart of Obadiah's twisted kingdom, became an inferno within minutes. The windowless structure had been designed to contain sound, but now it served as a perfect furnace, the thick walls trapping heat and flame until the interior became a hellscape that no human could survive. The ceremonial items that had been used in the perverted rituals, the altar, the cushions, the brass chalice, all fed the flames that consumed the evidence of years of systematic abuse. "Martha's still in there!" Rebecca screamed from behind the safety of Morrison's position, her voice raw with anguish and guilt. "And Ezekiel, I don't know if he's alive or dead." The blood from her split lip had frozen in the cold air, creating a grotesque mask that reflected the horror of the situation. Crawford made a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career, weighing the lives of potential victims against the safety of his men. "Morrison, get these people to safety. I'm going in." The federal marshal sprinted across the open courtyard as flames began to spread from the temple to the main house, his boots crunching through snow that was already beginning to melt from the heat of the fire. The front door of the main house had been barricaded from the inside with furniture and wooden planks, but the fire was creating enough chaos and structural damage that Crawford was able to break through a side window that had been hastily boarded up. Glass cut his hands as he forced his way through the opening, but adrenaline masked the pain as he dropped into the smoke-filled interior. Inside, the scene was one of complete devastation that spoke to the violence of the final confrontation between father and son. Furniture had been overturned during the struggle, creating an obstacle course of broken wood and scattered belongings. Blood stained the wooden floor in patterns that told the story of a desperate fight, while smoke from the spreading fire made visibility almost impossible. Ezekiel lay motionless near the fireplace, a bullet wound in his shoulder still seeping blood onto the floor beneath him. His face was pale from blood loss, but his chest rose and fell with the shallow breathing of someone clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. The rifle that had been the focus of the struggle lay nearby, its barrel bent from being used as a club during the fight. Martha Lafferty sat in the corner, rocking back and forth and singing hymns in a voice that had been broken by madness and trauma. Her eyes stared through Crawford to some other reality, seeing angels and demons that existed only in her shattered mind. She seemed oblivious to the smoke and flames, lost in a world where the physical dangers around her were less real than the psychological horrors she had endured. "Ma'am!" Crawford called to her, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "We need to get you out of here. The building's on fire." But Martha looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through him to some cosmic drama playing out beyond human understanding. "The angels are coming," she whispered, her voice carrying the eerie calm of complete dissociation. "They're coming to take us home. The suffering is almost over." Her words chilled Crawford more than the winter air outside, speaking to a level of psychological damage that might never be repaired. Crawford realized that the woman was too far gone to cooperate rationally, her mind having retreated so far from reality that she could no longer distinguish between salvation and destruction. He would have to carry both her and the wounded Ezekiel to safety, and time was running out as smoke began to fill the room and the fire spread through the building's wooden structure. Meanwhile, in the burning temple, Obadiah Lafferty was conducting his final ceremony, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes. The altar where he had violated his own children was now wreathed in flames, while the ceremonial items he had used to justify his perversions melted and twisted in the intense heat. He knelt in prayer as flames consumed everything around him, his voice raised in a final appeal to the divine authority he believed had sanctioned his actions. "Angel of judgment," he cried out, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "I have served you faithfully. I have followed your commandments without question. Grant me the martyrdom I have earned through my devotion." But there was no divine response, only the crackling of flames and the acrid smell of burning wood and flesh. In his final moments, as the fire closed in around him and the smoke filled his lungs, Obadiah Lafferty faced the truth that his followers had been too terrified to speak, that his visions had been nothing more than the delusions of a sick mind, and his angel of judgment was merely the voice of his own twisted desires, given divine authority through self-deception and madness. The realization came too late to save anyone, but it came nonetheless. As consciousness faded and the flames claimed his body, Obadiah understood that he had destroyed his family and corrupted innocent souls, not in service to God, but in service to his own appetites. The knowledge died with him, taking to the grave any possibility of repentance or redemption. Crawford managed to drag both Martha and Ezekiel from the burning building just as the roof began to collapse, sending showers of sparks into the winter sky. The main house was now fully engulfed, its wooden structure no match for the fire that had spread from the temple with supernatural speed. The heat was so intense that it melted snow for hundreds of yards in all directions, creating a circle of bare ground around the compound. As the rescue team regrouped at a safe distance, they took stock of the survivors with the grim efficiency of people who had seen too much tragedy. 7 children had been saved, ranging in age from 8 to 17, but their faces bore the hollow expressions of those who had witnessed horrors beyond their ability to process. Rebecca and Sarah, the two younger wives, were physically unharmed but psychologically shattered, their minds struggling to comprehend their sudden freedom after years of captivity. Martha would require long-term care for her mental condition, her mind having retreated so far from reality that she might never fully return. Ezekiel faced both physical recovery from his gunshot wound and the psychological burden of having finally stood up to his father, an act of courage that had come at tremendous cost to his own well-being. "What about the others?" Dr. Hayes asked, as he tended to the wounded, his medical bag open and his hands working with practiced efficiency. "Were there other followers in the compound?" "3 men and 2 women," Rebecca replied numbly, her voice flat with shock and exhaustion. "They were in the smaller building when the fire started. I think they chose to stay." Her words carried the weight of understanding that some people would rather die with their delusions than face the truth about what they had enabled. Indeed, as the flames spread to the 3rd building, no one emerged from the followers' quarters. The men and women who had enabled Obadiah's crimes had apparently chosen to die with their prophet rather than face the consequences of their actions. Whether this was a conscious decision or simply the result of being trapped by the fire would never be known, but their silence spoke to the complete psychological control that Obadiah had exercised over his followers. The fire burned through the night, consuming not only the buildings but also most of the physical evidence of the horrors that had taken place within them. By morning, only charred ruins remained of what had once been the Lafferty compound, the blackened timbers and melted metal serving as a monument to the destruction that fanaticism could wreak on human lives. In the days that followed, as the survivors were relocated and began the long process of healing, Miriam's diary became the primary evidence in what would become one of the most disturbing criminal cases in territorial Utah's history. The detailed accounts she had recorded provided prosecutors with enough evidence to understand the full scope of Obadiah's crimes, even though the perpetrator himself was beyond earthly justice. The legal proceedings were complicated by the fact that most of the physical evidence had been destroyed in the fire, leaving only Miriam's testimony and the accounts of the other survivors to piece together the full extent of the abuse. Federal prosecutors worked carefully to build a case that would serve as a warning to other would-be prophets who might be tempted to use religious authority to justify criminal behavior. The children were placed with relatives or foster families far from Hollow Creek, their new guardians carefully selected for their ability to provide the specialized care that trauma survivors required. Dr. Hayes worked with colleagues from back east to develop treatment protocols for the severe psychological damage that had been inflicted, understanding that recovery would be a process measured in years rather than months. Rebecca and Sarah were provided with new identities and transportation to distant communities where they could start over, their past carefully concealed to protect them from the stigma that might follow survivors of such notorious crimes. The territorial government established a fund to support their rehabilitation and ensure that they would never again be vulnerable to the kind of exploitation they had endured. The official records of the case were sealed to protect the privacy of the victims, but rumors of what had happened in the isolated compound spread throughout the territory like wildfire. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of maintaining connections with the broader community to prevent such isolation and abuse. Miriam herself struggled with survivors' guilt and the knowledge that her escape had triggered the final tragedy, even though she understood intellectually that staying would not have prevented the ultimate confrontation. Dr. Hayes worked with her for months, helping her understand that she had saved lives by revealing the truth, even though she couldn't save everyone. "You were just a child yourself," he reminded her during one of their sessions, his voice gentle but firm. "You did the only thing you could do. You told the truth. The responsibility for what happened lies with your father, not with you. Your courage saved your siblings and exposed a monster who would have continued to harm innocent people." Years later, as Miriam built a new life under a different name in California, she would sometimes dream of the flames that consumed Hollow Creek. But she also remembered the faces of her younger siblings, alive and free, because she had found the courage to speak out against the monster who had hidden behind the mask of religious authority. The ruins of the Lafferty compound were eventually reclaimed by the wilderness, the blackened timbers slowly rotting away and being covered by new growth. But the story of what happened there served as a dark reminder of how easily faith could be corrupted by those who sought to use it for their own twisted purposes. In the end, Obadiah Lafferty's legacy was not the spiritual kingdom he had envisioned, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the courage required to stand against it. The most horrific sexual practices of the Lafferty family had finally been exposed and ended, but the scars they left on their victims would last for generations, a reminder that some wounds never fully heal. The survivors would carry their trauma for the rest of their lives, but they would also carry the knowledge that they had escaped from hell and lived to tell the truth. In a world where such horrors often remained hidden, their testimony served as both warning and hope. Warning of what could happen when power was abused, and hope that even the darkest secrets could eventually be brought into the light.